19th century literature. As the title shows, we are about to deal with types of writing during a historical moment, 19th century literature. And when I say 19th century literature, I'm about to say about early 19th century, mid 19th century literature, both British and American. And in the first part, I'm going to deal with the type of early 19th century literature, which means I have to show the transition from the 18th into the 19th century. And as you know, the historical period in Europe from the medieval time to the Renaissance until the Enlightenment, we are dealing with a series of periods until we reach the 19th century moment. Before 19th century literature, we can talk about Neoclassicism, a period, a movement which started before the next one in early 19th century. Neoclassicism as belonging to the age of Enlightenment, which means it starts from 17th until the end of 18th century. And during this period, we have the impact of reason, logos, use of the mind, and a kind of literature that was produced during this period was concerned with human nature, supremacy of reason, and new classical literature deals with common sense, order, accuracy, and structure. And some popular literature and types of literature included parody, essays, satires, letters, fables, melodrama, and rhyming with couplets. It is much more a movement against individualism, that is too much use of individualism and imagination. That is to say, a much more conservative self-control control and restraint. That is to say, in the neoclassical periods, poets had to abide by certain rules, regulation, propriety, in order to produce a type of literature. That is, means that the kind of literature produced in neoclassical era was limited through restrictions. And the beginning of the century, the 19th century, started with the questioning these neoclassical values. And this is to relativize the absolutes of the previous century, and it opposed neoclassicism and Enlightenment. So it means that translation that questioning the absolute perceptions, and instead of the power and the dominance of the logos, the heart. The heart has reasons that reason is not equipped to understand. And the heart as a source of knowledge became one of the other factors included in reacting to the dominance of the logos, sensations, feelings, and emotions. And you can see that I am moving from the new classical period into what I am going to say Romanticism. And Romanticism marked the beginning of the 19th century, and it marked especially the last decade of the 18th and the beginning and the first decade of the 19th century. That's why I say when I talk about 19th century literature, I am dealing with the first half of the 19th century, and later, second half, the mid-19th century, we'll see another movement entitled Realism. Now, here, this part here is focusing much more on the Romantic movement, and Romantic movement say that it is a shift from Neoclassicism into the Romantic era. Now, and here we are about to see what Romanticism is, what are its general features, and who are the representative figures of this movement. First of all, I quote here from William Blake, one of the early Romanticists, The divine arts of imagination, imagination, the real and eternal world of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow. Here, power of imagination, and we'll see with William Blake, kind of poetry introduced the mystical, the mythical, the biblical, the supernatural, other factors included in introducing poetry. Lyrical ballads, famous introduction by William Wordsworth, it is, and Samuel Coleridge, it marked the beginning of the Romantic period. If we try to define Romanticism, complex, artistic, literary, and intellectual movement, it originated in the second half of the 18th century in Western Europe and gained strength in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. And here we start with some of the remarkable changes of the century, as we will see. It is a revolt against the aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment and the reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. Look at here, nature. It is against the rationalism of nature. And we'll see with the Romantic, it is the emotional, the sensational part of nature, and embodied the most strongly in the visual arts, music, and literature. Before we see some of the features of this movement, there were some important historical events related to the period. Political upheaval in France and the United States touched England as well. Turbulent times beat realities, beginning in America in 1776, an age of revolution swept across Europe, releasing political, economic, and social forces and produced during the next century. Some of the most radical changes ever experienced in human life. Another way to date the Romantic period is to say that it started with the French Revolution, very important, 1789, and the French Revolution did have an impact on the Romantic movement, since the key term is freedom, freedom of expression. Freedom is a buzzword of the time. That's why it is a new democratic value entering the field of literature. William Blake, Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge were born before the period began and lived through most of all of it. The second generation, Shelley, Keats, Byron, these are Romantic poets, and their shortcomings in the second decade of the new century, but died before. It was a revolutionary age, and England changed from an agricultural society to an industrial nation with a large and restless working class, concentrated in the teeming mill towns. As I said, the American Revolution, great economic loss, but it was also loss of prestige and of confidence for Britain. Impact of French Revolution, and to English conservatives, the French Revolution meant the triumph of radical principles, and they feared that the revolution would spread across the channel. But democratic idealists and liberals like Wordsworth felt exhilarated by the events in France, since it brought a new values, as I said, of a revolutionary value of freedom. And during the revolution's early years, they even made trips to France to view the new regime at first hand, as if it were a tourist attraction. And Wordsworth later wrote, I quote here, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." Expression of a joy of living the moment of declaration of freedom. Also, the impact of the capitalistic system, Laissez-Faire, the Industrial Revolution was bringing about other changes in England. Production switched to factories where machines worked many times faster than human beings could work with machinery. Factories were in cities, and the cities' populations increased, causing desperate living conditions that would appall even the most hardened social worker. Now, this is very important. We'll see it especially in the next part, the second half, and how the realistic fiction reacted to these power of the capitalist system and the hard times of the working class, and how realistic fiction expressed the moment, the hard moment this class is living under. The rich owners here of the land transformed the fields into vast private parks. Others divided the land neatly into privately held fields. Whatever happened to land, it was no longer communally owned, and this resulted in in large numbers of landless people moving, migration into cities, and that's another story. We'll see it, the impact of migration, urbanization, industrialization, especially in the second part of the 19th century. As I said here, the economic power of the capitalistic system and this dominant philosophy of laissez-faire here, according to this policy, economic forces should be allowed to operate freely without government interference. And the result here is that the rich grew richer and the poor suffered even more. Frustrated by England's resistance to political and social change that would improve conditions, the Romantic poets, and this is what interests us here, turned from the formal public verse of the 18th century Oceans to a more private, spontaneous lyric poetry. And here you can see the reaction against the neoclassical restrictions. These lyrics expressed the Romantics' belief that imagination rather than mere reason was the best response to the forces of change. Wordsworth himself spoke of imagination in this way: it is spiritual love, acts not nor can exist without imagination, which in truth is but another name for absolute power and clear insight, amplitude of mind and reason in her most exalted mood, exhilarating power of imagination. And the poets of the Romantic period responded to these social and economic changes caused by rapid industrialization and to governmental policies that ignored the problems of the poor. What does Romantic mean? The word Romantic comes from the term romance, one of the most popular genres of medieval times. Late Romantic writers self-consciously used the elements of romance in an attempt to go back beyond the refinements of neoclassical literature, as I said, to other types of writing that they saw as more genuine. And the romance genre also allowed writers to explore new, more psychological and mysterious aspects of human experience. As a historical term, Romantic has at least three useful meanings, all of them relevant to the Romantic poets. First, the term Romantic signifies fascination with youth and innocence with growing up. It is a kind of a regeneration and revival, learning to trust one's emotions and senses of will and identity. Second, the term Romantic is applied to a stage in the cyclical development of societies. This is the stage when people need to question tradition and authority in order to imagine better. So Romantic is a moment of alleviating oneself from the statu quo and trying to think of something happier, better. It is a sense associated with idealism. Third, Romantic period of the first half of the 20th century was reached the condition necessary for industrialization. This demanded that people acquire a stronger awareness of change and that they try to find ways to adapt to it. In this sense, we still live with the legacy of the Romantic period. The term Romantic also signifies a fascination with youth, as I said, questioning traditions, authority, and looking for idealist purposes and change. General features of Romanticism here turned away, as I said, from the 18th century emphasis on reason, order, propriety. Romantics embraced imagination and naturalness. They rejected the public, formal, and witty works of the previous century. They preferred poetry that spoke of personal experiences and emotions, often in simple and adorned language. The Romantics also each used the lyric as the form best used. So poetry is a very characteristic of Romanticism here, self-reliance and imagination. Wordsworth urged poets to adopt a democratic attitude toward their audiences, though endowed with a special sensibility. The poet was always a man speaking to man. Many romantics turned to a past, so reviving the past, and they felt was more picturesque than magical than the ugly industrial age they lived in. So you can see that Romanticism is somehow a reaction to the hard moment of industrialization and ugliness produced by such a regime. Believed in individual liberty and sympathized with those who rebelled against tyranny. Thought of nature also as transformative, fascinated by the ways nature and the human mind mirrored the other's creative properties, the power of nature in inspiring the human and man part of the nature. When we deal with Romanticism, we should not fail to mark the importance of lyrical ballad produced by Wordsworth and Coleridge. And in this, it marks, in fact, the beginning of Romanticism in Britain. And in this collection, Wordsworth declared that he was writing a new kind of poetry that he hoped would be well adapted to interest mankind permanently. And the subject matter would be different from that earliest figures poetry like Dryden and Pope belonging to the neoclassical period, who used poetry to satirize, persuade the reader with argumentative techniques. Poetry is not that. It is something else. And for Wordsworth, poetry was, as we know, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And such poetry should use simple and adorned language to deal with commonplace subject for a particular purpose. The form also is often a lyric that lends itself to spontaneity, immediacy, quick bursts of emotion, self-revelation. He focused also on rural instead of city life because the country, as I said, the passions of man are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Look at here, when we deal with romantic, we are talking about the imagination, the power of imagination, the power of nature, passions, feelings, spontaneity, subjectivity. And Wordsworth found hope in certain inherent and indestructible qualities of the human mind, and likewise certain powers in the great and permanent object. So the permanent and the power object can reveal important feelings. There is nature and there are human beings to experience nature, nature and human beings within nature. The Romantics are often called nature poets, and the description is misleading if it suggests that their poetry is full of charming senses of forests, mountains, and streams, like the scenic overlooks on highways, the picture on travel brochures. But the Romantic praised experiences of the beauty and majesty of nature. They didn't think of nature as hostile, but they had a strong sense of its mysterious forces, and they were intrigued by the way nature and the human mind act upon each other, one having an impact on the other. In the preface also, Wordsworth says that the poet considers man and nature as essentially adapted to each other, and the mind of man as not only a mirror of the fairest and the most interesting property of nature, the purity of the soul, and nature as relieving and healing. Each of the Romantic poets had his own special view of the creative power, and this is another important feature of Romantics here. There are various poets with everyone having a certain orientation. If Wordsworth is dealing with nature, Coleridge is with imagination, while Shelley, for example, has a revolutionary spirit, and while Blake is with the mystical and the mythical. The poems usually present imaginative experiences as very powerful or moving. In addition to being a special faculty of the mind, the imagination is also a kind of desire, a motive that drives the mind to learn and to know things. It cannot learn by rational and logical thinking. And that's another feature, as I said, reason for them and logic of the mind is not the only truth, but there are other truths that can be reflected upon by sensations, intuition, and feelings. And the purpose of this imitation is to create new realities in the mind as a result in the poetry. Poetry was no longer used to make complex arguments in a witty, polished style. Romantic poets used an adorned language to explore the significance of commonplace subject, the beauty of nature, and the power of the human imagination. And to clarify his remarks about poetry, Wordsworth added to his preface a long section on the question, what is a poet? And his answer began, he is a man speaking to man. Simplicity, emotion, addressing the human feeling. There is a person in the poem, and we will call him a speaker, to distinguish him from the poet who is speaking to someone or something else. A young Highlands girl, a baby asleep in a cottage, a skylark, even a Greek vase. Okay, so a man speaking to things, and these things make them speak through his imagination. Each poem of this type not only asks us to imagine or pretend that the speaking is taking place, but also makes us consider what kind of speaking is taking place. The speaker also is the speaker praising or confessing or complaining. The speaking in lyric poetry is not the question reason in verse, as I said before. It is a more emotional, passionate speaking from the heart. It has been said that we do not hear lyric poetry so much as overhear it. I should not repeat the idea of the power of imagination again here. The speaking also should be convincing so that it can seem a genuine and insincere account of that experience, no matter how special or extravagant the experience may appear to be. Saying that the poet is a man speaking to man, Wordsworth did not mean that the poet is just a man. In the preface again, it's clear that the speaker, this man, is a special person endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, a greater knowledge of a human nature, and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. So, though he is a man speaking to other man, but he is endowed with a higher sensibility. And though the word supposed may suggest that Wordsworth thought his fellow citizens had too low an estimate of much of humankind, all of the Romantic poets describe the poet in such lofty terms, elevating the position of the poet as someone, as I said, endowed with another power superior with true imagination. William Blake, one of the precursors of Romantic periods and the Romantic tradition, said that the poet was the bard and an inspired revealer and teacher. So, revealer. When we read William Blake's poetry, for example, and in his collection of poems, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Inexperience, we can say the cyclical movement of the words of the universe, beginning, development, and end, and we come back. If you read, for example, the Echoing Green as an example, or the Schoolboy, we can follow the cyclical movement, and that's why it is much more mystical, much more philosophical. According to Coleridge, when we name Coleridge, we have the power of imagination. And Coleridge said that the poet brings the whole soul of man into activity by employing the synthetic and magical power, the imagination, the power of imagination according to Coleridge. Example, again, if we read, for example, Kubla Khan, we will see what I say, Kubla Khan and the power of imagination. Shelley, in his ode to the West Wind, calling the West Wind as a challenge, that calling for the West Wind as to come and sweep the calamities and bring new things. It says that the unknowledge legislator of the world. So the poet here is someone who can bring new laws to the world according to freedom. Keats, in his Ode to Autumn, as an example here, wrote that the poet is physician to all humanity and pours out a balm upon the world. I bring here, for example, four examples of common poets of the Romantic poet: Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. Just these are some of the representative figures, one with nature, or the other with imagination, one with mysticism, and so on and so on. Okay. And nothing wrote Wordsworth in The Recluse can breed such fear and awe as fall upon us often when we look into our minds, into the mind of man, my haunt and the main region of my song. The poet is someone human beings cannot do without. And the Romantic poets found a way through the imagination to fulfill the poet's traditional role as prophet, priest, and king in a time of change. I finish with this quote here: the poet, prophet, priest, and king. You can see here the label the poet with series of words which give the poet a value, changing and inspiring and trying to bring a certain idealist value to and richness of the human existence.